Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today for the B20 Virtual Forum, Preparing for the Second Wave. My name is Linda Yueh, and I am delighted to be your moderator for this forum, organized by the B20, the private sector voice of the G20 community. As countries may face a second wave of infection within a few months, this virtual forum will review the steps that should be taken to prepare. The potential impact will be explored on the global economy and what governments and businesses can do to mitigate the risk. We will take a look at all of those and discuss the importance of international cooperation, which will be key to help governments and businesses plan. We have an exciting agenda today. We'll first hear about the B20's actions taken during the pandemic, followed by a macroeconomic panel. Then we'll hear from the World Health Organization, followed by a second panel on the business imperative. We're live streaming this forum on Twitter, so welcome to all of you following there as well. You can follow the conversation on Twitter, go to the handle @B20, and participate in the discussion by using the hashtag B20Virtual. Our first guest today is the chair of B20 Saudi Arabia, Mr. Yousef Abdullah Al-Benyan. Mr. Al-Benyan is the vice chairman and CEO of SABIC, one of the world's largest petrochemical manufacturers. Welcome, Mr. Al-Benyan. I'm going to start off, delighted to have this conversation with you. I'm going to start off just by asking you to outline for us what role the B20 has played in addressing COVID-19 and the actions that you've taken so far.
Well, Linda, thank you very much for being part of this, panel. In the same times, I hope you and your entire family is safe and healthy. If you would just allow me at the beginning, we just to remind everyone on this virtual meeting that the B20 has a very clear role to play, and I think also the B20 will positions to provide the platform, the collaborative platform for governments and private sector to really have a healthy, constructive dialogue to deal with various challenges. And I think 2020 is a very unique a year where the challenges are different from the previous B20 participation since the B20 incepted 10 years ago. Now, to start with that, I think the role of B20 as the voice of the global business community, we have been very active to engage with the G20 leaders from the beginning. When the crisis started in January and increased the pressure beginning of February, we started really having a very intense engagement with the G20 leaders. And I think we have a very strong participations also on the final statements from the G20 virtual interim meeting that have been hosted by our King on March this year. And I think we have stated clearly the requirements as the voice of the global business community that we need the governments to be quickly agile and respond to the demands of this pandemic. And this is why we came up with the interim report that we have just launched, a week ago. This report has really addressed the key challenges that we would like really to look after. One is we need to make sure that we have a very resilient healthcare system that is really supported to provide the right health care and services to our global citizen. We want to make sure that we safeguard the human capital and support the financial stability, and more importantly also try to revive certain sector that is really employ the maximum jobs and provided the maximum jobs offering for our global citizen, like the hospitality sector, for example. And in addition to provide a clear need to activate any measures that to enable the supply chain system to go back into a normal. Of course, this is without any compromise for our compliance, which normally, unfortunately, during crisis, always pushed back on the back burners. So we want to make sure as a B20 that the compliance and integrity should remain also in the top priority while we are coming with an interim measures to overcome some of the problems we have. And this is really have been clearly addressed in our recommendations to our leaders to address very strong immediate impact that we have seen. One is, I think we see a lot of pressure on our SMEs globally, this is the major platform and engine for job creations. In the same time, we need to take actions to minimize the job losses and maintain even, in fact, preparations for a recovery to go back into the right global economy that can create the jobs that is needed for our youth.
That brings me nicely on to my question for you, specifically on small and medium-sized enterprises. What do governments and businesses need to do to protect them?
Well, I think the SMEs is it's going to be a very crucial for our global economy. As you can see from the IMF, if you continue lockdown and deal with the current crisis in a longer period of time, we are going to experience, at least based on the number that have been provided through their research, you're talking about you're going to lose 50% of the SMEs permanently. And this is why in our recommendations with the G20 leaders, despite the fact that there is a talk about second and third wave, we are encouraging our G20 leaders to make sure that they are building their healthcare capacity to deal with the resurgence of this pandemic, and make sure that they avoid locking down the system, because by default, this is going to create a lot of challenges. And this is clearly addressing the survival of the SMEs, because the more we leave the economy is open, I think this will help to survive the SMEs, and subsequently will minimize also the losses of jobs that we are experiencing at this point.
Absolutely. They're massive job creators. But that leads me to a related issue, which is the role of finance in helping businesses manage the crisis. Specifically in terms of government stimulus packages and private sector finance, if you could speak about the role that finance plays and should play in this period.
Well, I have to start with the fact that this time, the G20 finance ministers and central banks leaders, I think they have been proactively responsive to the crisis, comparing to the previous ones that we have seen, comparing, for example, to the financial crisis. Took them a while to come up with their own programs and policy. Therefore, in this time of the pandemic of COVID-19, I think we have to give them a credit. They have been immediately responsive, of course, coming with a policy that is really catered for that specific G20 needs and requirements. The issues on the current challenges that we are facing is not really a financial issues. We have a structural issues that we need to keep in mind beyond the stimulus packages. And this is why we have been very clear on the B20 on our engagement with the governments, that we advise them not to look at only the stimulus packages, the solutions to help the economy to revive, right? This is only one part of it. At the same time, also, we are trying to encourage our business community in a global sense that they should not only look at this as a source of fund just to ease the current problems, and that's it. I think we need to work on a collaborative, inclusive way between the financial institutions and the business sector to make sure that we are minimizing the exposure we could lead to. Because the current stimulus packages has created the highest debt on the global sovereignty level. And I think countries will need to manage this in order for them to make sure that they continue playing their role. That's also applied to the business community. They want to make sure that they don't also load their balance sheet with a debt that is not necessarily will be inducive to sustain the current business or even help them into the growth model.
Thank you. I want to ask you about this balance between the need to restart economies with the concerns over a potential second wave. It would be very good to hear your thoughts around this balance as governments and businesses think about this issue.
Well, I think we supported initially the governments taking a time to lock down their system because this was really a shock and surprise to the entire globe. And I think they needed the right time for them to develop their capacity and capability to cope with the current pandemic. In the same time, also start their awareness campaign to their citizens. Since February and up to date, I think the governments globally, they have been able to come up with the proper actions to build up the right capacity. And at the same time, I think leveraging our global media and social media, people are well connected and they have seen what is required from the people and citizens globally to take their own also self-help measures to reduce the exposure to the COVID-19. Having said that, I think that's clearly it's going to be the way moving forward. We should not lock down the system. Either we have second or third wave. I think we need to live with it and we need to learn how to manage it, but without locking down the system, because locking down the system is going to create more complex, not only in the economical side of it, but also from a social perspective. And I think this is why we need to be very mindful of the fact that if we lock down the system, is not only hurting immediately the business, because that's what's going to affect, but it's going to have a ripple effect for other life, the other elements of our global lives, including the social life, and of course, educational system is not going to be supportive with a complete lockdown, which is very needed also for our business community to go back into reality. One thing probably I should mention as well, if you allow me, Linda, it's I think one of the biggest lessons learned that we have experienced from this pandemic is the investment on digitizations. And I think this is a very important element that the B20 have addressed, that digital economy inclusiveness is going to be very important. It's not only for the G20 countries, but also we have included, of course, the list, basically more other nations that they are not necessarily in a position to invest on digitizations or infrastructure that enable them to have access to internet. And I think this is part of our recommendation as well, to have this globally spread to enable all people in the globe to benefit from this investment. Thank you.
Fantastic. Just a final question for you, Mr. Al-Benyan. How confident are you that governments and businesses are planning for a possible rebound of the virus, considering the first wave still hasn't ended for many countries? Of course, their first step is to watch this forum and read your report. But aside from that, do talk us through the plans you'd like to see governments and businesses undertake.
Well, I think we need to be continuously optimistic about our future. I think in my experience as a global business leader, one of the benefits from this crisis that governments across the globe, specifically the G20 leaders and also the regulators, including the business community on the global stage, that we had no choice except to work on collaborative approach. I mean, prior to this pandemic, we have seen a trade war across the globe. We have seen some protectionism, proposals and actions have been taken, which limits the free trade across border, limit the free cross border of talent, and so on. I think we have experienced this mode immediately after the crisis. Countries locked down their basically borders and created fences around their nations. They think that we can protect ourselves and we can take care of ourselves. But after 6 weeks, 7 weeks from the crisis, I think everybody has realized that the only way for them to overcome this crisis successfully and effectively, we need to work on a very inclusive, collaborative way to help each other. And that's our advice to the global leaders and also to the government agency as well.
Fantastic advice. And thank you very much, Mr. Al-Benyan, for all of your thoughtful insights. A reminder to attendees, you can follow the conversation on Twitter at B20 and also participate in the discussion by using hashtag B20 virtual. And I would also point you to the B20 Special Report, where you can read more about the recommendations that Mr. Al-Benyan has so helpfully outlined for us. We now move to the first panel of this forum, which will give us the macroeconomic picture. And this is the macroeconomic picture of the potential impact of a second wave as economies reopen. In this session, we will look at giving you an analysis of what has worked and what still needs to take place from a government and a business perspective to mitigate the impact of a potential second wave. To do this, I'm pleased to be joined by Luis de Mello, Director of the Policy Studies Branch at the Economics Department of the OECD, Chris Nicholas, Executive Vice President and CFO of Walmart International, and Rayan Fayez, B20 Finance and Infrastructure Task Force Chair. A warm welcome to you all, and just a reminder to please turn on your cameras. We will take a couple of questions from attendees, so please submit your question with your name, organization, and the name of the speaker it's directed to in the Q&A box, which you can find on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So let's kick off the panel, and I'm going to turn to Luis first, because I'd like to talk about unemployment. How long and what measures do you think it will take to return the economy and the labor force to what it was pre-COVID?
Thanks, Linda. It's a great pleasure to join you today. Many thanks for the invitation. Indeed, it's a tall order. We are talking about the worst economic crisis we are facing, and the global economy has been since the 30s, the 1930s. So it's really much worse than what we've seen before. To give you an idea, we had recently in our economic outlook worked on two different scenarios. One in which the global economy recovers, there is no comeback, there is no second wave to this pandemic. And in that scenario, the global economy would contract this year by 6%. That's a huge number. It's much more than it did at the global crisis. If there is a second scenario, then the global economy would contract by about 8%. It would take until many years to recover and to go back to the situation we were at the end of last year. Take again just one number, the latest number that we have for the first quarter of this year. It's already a drop in global GDP by about 3.25% relative to the end of last year. So it's a long way until we can recover. A lot of income loss, job losses, potential business failures that we'll need to work on, try to prevent as we restart our economies and try to prevent a second wave.
Let me just follow up quickly. So the economy may take years to recover. Normally, unemployment takes even longer than that. So do you have a sense as to how quickly the labor force might return?
It will not return, Linda, for the reasons you mentioned before the economy comes back. So the labor force will adjust as the economy goes along. And there, the policies that are being taken by governments play a very important part. You see a lot of emphasis that is being placed on job retention schemes. So efforts that try to minimize the increase in unemployment, and most importantly, try to make sure that workers remain attached to their firms, remain with links to the activities that they've been performing. So this is an important aspect that has to do with this transition until we move on to another situation that will be consistent with the type of growth that we had before the crisis.
Thank you. Chris, I want to turn to you and ask how businesses and governments can partner to deal with this significant economic impact, including that of a second wave.
Hey, Linda, thanks for having me on. You know, as we've heard, one of the macroeconomic impacts of COVID-19 is a significant recession across the board that requires economic stimulus. And as we know, governments are not in a position to effect stimulus to the level to respond to the crisis that's required. And so therefore, business and government need to come together. And we've got three ideas on working towards that goal. So the first is around improving the ease of doing business. The second is support for small businesses. We've heard about that already today in the supply chain. And the third, and I think maybe the most impactful, is the role that business plays in the formalization agenda. So on the first, around improving the ease of doing business, you know, most business facilitation makes an impact through long-range investment, but we need shovel-ready projects today. The creation of jobs is crucial. We just heard that. Construction is recognized as an essential service, but nonetheless, a lot of these projects that are ready to go are paralyzed because of licensing and permitting, which is halted during the pandemic. So we need to massively accelerate the digital transformation in this area because the projects are there, people need to work, but government have got deficit in digital tools. And this licensing objective is more feasible now. People are more used to using digital tools to solve problems. And, you know, the B20 has embraced this policy of digitalization of licensing and permits in its recommendations to COVID-19 response, digitalization and integrity and compliance, but it needs to move from the B20 to the G20 to get cut through. On the small businesses, which is absolutely crucial, undoubtedly one of the greatest impacts is the stress on firms and therefore on households. We see this in our supply chain. We see small businesses that are under stress. Walmart's doing a lot, of course, as we would expect, because we work with a lot of small suppliers around financing support, flexible terms, and of course the fact that we remain open means that they get to operate and stay liquid. But ultimately, the solutions for small businesses are something that is multiplicitous and is not just about Walmart selling products. The third, and this formalization agenda, is something I'm really passionate about, and it really matters. Pre-existing inequality that we've seen has been exacerbated by COVID, and we can see that, and it can only be solved in a systemic way. And part of this is to recognize the role that private sector can play in expanding the envelope of economic opportunity, and that's geographically, obviously, and class-wise. So Walmart, we come in at the base of the pyramid with many of our formats. And also we've got high compliance standards. We heard about the importance of compliance. We agree fully to allow the company. So we have a disproportionate effect on formalization across consumption, across employment, and across supply chain. Now, this formalization role advances a lot of government policy goals, most notably and importantly, tax generation. We know that's important as stimulus comes through, but also the creation of inclusive career opportunities. So retail, the sector of retail it's just irreplaceable as a partner in governments on pulling forward that socioeconomic inclusion agenda. It's not just about retail though, it is more broad, and business and government need more than a mercantilist relationship, more than a transactional relationship. It needs to be genuinely collaborative if we're going to solve this.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very concrete thoughts to take away. Rayan, I want to turn to you and just explore some of the geo-economic impact of a second wave.
Thank you. Thanks, Linda, and thanks for the rest of the B20 organization for having me here today. It's my pleasure and honor to be with you and to be with Iman and his team set of panelists in our discussion today. We've seen, as we all know, governments announcing and implementing various policy responses that suit their domestic situation and capabilities. However, as we all know, the COVID pandemic is a consequence of an intricately woven social and economic system. As we see in today's world, health, social, and economic contagion transcends borders. And in our view, particularly at the B20 and onto the G20, leaders must really agree on policy solutions that transcend sovereign interests for a global common good. And this is a point that we really believe in strongly at the B20 level. Having this multilateral group from the B20 and obviously feeding to the G20, we believe strongly in the view that there is no alternative to global cooperation and collaboration and consensus to overcome the systemic crisis like the one, like the crisis like this one. So a fit for purpose global approach is an absolute necessity. Even though there's a common, even though the threat is common, its intensity varies across countries. And as we've seen, particularly these days, even within regions of countries, the threat varies and the severity varies quite significantly. So the common lessons and approaches to tackling the crisis are as much necessary as their customization to distinct realities and circumstances that happen across regions and across countries. And we believe, and we've strongly advocated this, that any effort to contain or mitigate the economic impact must really be inclusive, tailored to different geographies and circumstances. Inclusiveness is really part of one of the principles and pillars that we worked with in the B20 under the presidency of Mr. Yousef Al-Benyan, but also tackled this point across all the task forces that we're working within, including the one that I chair within finance and infrastructure. And we've seen a lot of these ideas come through in the various communication that we have either drafted as a task force or even escalated to the G20 for adoption. And we're glad to see a lot of them being adopted.
Great to hear. Thank you very much, Ryan. Louise, I want to turn back to you and just talk about these economic bailouts. Is there a limit to the economic bailouts of governments? And are they sustainable as we think about a potential second wave?
That's a very interesting point, Linda. The rescue packages that have been put in place by governments have been very ambitious, and they were needed. They were needed to ramp up capacity in the public health care system. They have been needed in terms of support to households and enterprises so that they could go through the worst phase of the crisis. As we move on, it will be increasingly difficult to maintain the level of support that governments have put in place. Take, for instance, public debt. According to our projections, in the median OECD country, debt is expected to rise by the end of this year by some 15% of GDP. This is more than it did at the time of the global crisis. So there are limits in the sense of how much more can be sustained over time. But what is important also to consider is that this support is needed now. If there is a second wave, governments will need to maintain the type of measures that have been put in place, especially the ones that are working well. But it's also important to move away from rescue towards reallocation, towards the recovery as economic activity starts to pick up. So the programs that will be put in place will need to consider this angle as well as we move forward. What are the job protection programs that will be most consistent with making sure that people who will be displaced in sectors that are suffering the most can find alternatives in more promising activities? What type of support for enterprises can be the ones that are most consistent with the recovery as activity takes hold? We don't want to be in a situation where we're going to come out of this with a huge structural unemployment because people couldn't relocate, or stranded assets in firms, businesses, or activities that will not have such a promising future as they were expected to before the crisis. So I think it's time to think of bailout, but also to think of the move away from bailout and towards the recovery.
Louise, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I sort of am, which is there a level of debt that you start to feel very nervous about? Or is it the case, listen, it's a global pandemic. All countries are in the same position. You must use effective policies to support another wave and the recovery.
Absolutely, Linda. It's no time to think about premature consolidation now. Debt levels are high, but debt service obligations are low given the levels of interest rates that governments are facing. So the one risk that we need to avoid, the one situation we need to avoid is what we had in the aftermath of the global crisis, where fiscal consolidation came in a little too soon given the strength of the recovery. What we needed to think about that, but in the future, not now. We're still fighting a pandemic. We're still trying to restart activity while avoiding a second wave. So it would be premature to think of consolidation at this stage.
Thank you very much, Louise. And just a reminder to the panelists to please mute yourself until it is your turn. And it is now Chris's turn. So if you could unmute yourself. Chris, I wanted to ask you about, from your experience, how this pandemic has affected your operations and supply chain. How are you adapting to these unforeseen developments?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Look, I think it's difficult to overstate the impact that this has had on us globally. In every corner of our business, this has been a truly extraordinary time, and honestly, there are hours of discussion material right there. But to cut to the quick, the pandemic has underscored the crucial importance of supply chain. We've seen in our businesses that supply chain, and that's supplier all the way through to the stores and omni and e-commerce beyond that, has become a lifeline for consumers and suppliers and associates. And the importance of the resilience of this, and in focusing on the resilience of this, is beyond debate, I think, now. We've worked to Walmart to make affordable shopping that we provide even more accessible, not less, at this time. So it's not a time to retrench, it's a time to innovate and reach out. And, we've seen in a lot of countries, but not all, that the entire food distribution chain has been seen as an essential service. And that's important. I think COVID-19 is an economic crisis, but as we just heard from Ryan, it's an inclusion crisis. It's an economic inclusion crisis too. And our socioeconomic inclusion role is more important than ever. And I think that whole supply chain role, it really hits on the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So it lights up health, freedom from hunger, inequality reduction, good jobs. So we've got to really focus on how robust this is, especially if we see another wave or more than that. But to enable a robust supply chain, what we learned really early, including in our stores, is that safety is of crucial importance here. And so we've invested substantially to keep our customers safe, our associates safe, our suppliers safe, and to support government and civil society efforts. So across the world, as an example, we were quick to roll out social distancing and hygiene measures in our stores and distribution centers, because if you don't keep them open, it becomes a real issue. And in Mexico, helping the government to fund a new hospital is just a great example of business and government coming together to collaborate on what matters. Slightly more progressively, I think you asked about adapting to it, and digitalization is a clear and important adaptation here. We were getting there, but this has accelerated exponentially in our business. It's an innovation engine that allows you to get around problems more quickly. It's an engine for growth. It's an engine for recovery. And I think we need to see that businesses and policymakers collaborating to help blend physical and digital, and to help speed up productivity and speed up routes to solving problems. And I mentioned licensing and permitting earlier as just one example, but they are multifarious.
Thank you very much, Chris. Rayan, I'm going to ask you one more question before we open it up to taking some of the audience questions. The question I would like to ask you, simple question, what will a second wave mean for the future of globalization, given what we've just heard Chris and the others say? And please unmute yourself, Rayan.
It's a very broad question, I believe. And as Mr. Yousef mentioned earlier, the deglobalization and the protectionist measures and actions have taken place way before COVID came in. So we have seen, obviously, a threat of that existed before. As also Chris mentioned, as we look at companies and businesses' behaviors through COVID, it moved from efficiency to resilience. Everyone was thinking about efficiency. Everyone was working in a just-in-time economics. I believe the world now is working in just-in-case economics. So when you look at that and try to translate that into what do businesses do at a local level and at a micro level, you can clearly see a threat of globalization emerge from businesses focusing in close proximity to their home markets. However, we still think that globalization is critical. It is important. It is something that the G20 finance ministers, central bank governors, and trade ministers have called for and have made good progress, notably through the G20 action plan and COVID statements that have made. The commitments that has been made at that level, at the highest level of the G20, we believe must be acted on to ensure unilateral actions don't affect multilateral progress. And we always face that risk in crises such as this one. These actions call for fiscal, monetary, trade, prudential measures to be taken, and also global collaboration with among standard setters at a global level. At the same time, policies and decisions are taken at a local level. So it is also important that the fundamental basis of global market-based economies and principles are preserved and respected as we look into the crisis. I think this is a unique period where governments are taking measures that I believe none of them have expected to have taken in such severity and such speed that they have taken. And I believe most of these measures have been in the right direction. I think there is also the temptation to take a more protectionist approach in these measures. We're glad to see that most of the governments haven't, and actually the strength of the multilateral organizations such as the G20, the ECB, and other organizations globally have stepped in, taken action in a very collaborative way. And that, I think, gives us all comfort that globalization still can carry a big role in such crisis, and the value of which will be seen as we look back into the behavior and actions taken by different governments.
Thank you very much, Rayan. So I now have a couple of audience questions. The first one, and I will pose it to each of the panelists, I think, which is, how do you think businesses have dealt with the pandemic so far? Have they stepped up to the expectations society has placed on them at this unprecedented time? So I think the hot seat has to go to Chris first on this one.
Hey, so look, it's a great question. And, if I would, business exists at the behest of customers, and that's the reality. And, the consumers need to be able to shop and interact and collaborate and work with businesses. I think in general, businesses have done a good job of stepping up, and mostly, I don't know if that is in more generally because of self-interest or because of a broader good. I can tell you in retail, it is both. It's the broader good matters, doing it in the right way matters, and that gives you the right outcome. I think there are very few businesses out there that are playing the victim, very few. I think most businesses understand the gravity of what they're facing. They're working with governments where possible. They're treating associates as well as they possibly can. And I think just a great example of where government and business have worked together is in the furlough processes that we've seen, which have allowed businesses to continue to keep their heads above water when they're struggling and keep their associates engaged and happy as they can be at a time when they can't do business. So I think in general, business has really shown what it can do at this time. And I think that we should feel really proud as a community that the voice we have around modernization the voice we have about how we treat our people, the voice we have about policy is in general being listened to. And government now understand, and business now understand at a broader level, at a macro level, that we can't solve it all on our own. We have to collaborate together.
Thank you very much, Chris. Same question to you, Rayan. What do you think about businesses and whether they have stepped up to deal with the pandemic so far?
I agree with everything Chris said, and we've seen the same thing happen in our sector broadly in terms of different relief packages and support packages to our customers, particularly those who are significantly impacted. But that came with a partnership with the government. I mean, the business did play its role in providing or meeting halfway with the government as to how relief measures can be actioned. The one thing I would add to what has said earlier is that I believe what this has done is put a spotlight on the social responsibilities that businesses have going forward. Even though in the past we used to look at it as, not we, but generally speaking, you know, environmental matters mattered a lot, and it had a significant part of the spotlight in the past. I believe social and governance parts of the ESG have now taken really the attention and focus on businesses as to how to strategically think about these measures and how doing these measures in the right way is actually good for business. Not only is it good for society, but it's also good for business. So I believe that's one key learning point from the business side in reaction to this. Even though we reacted, I believe, quite well, I think looking back, we would like to put in place the kind of the measures and the policies to ensure that we have this as part of our strategic agenda.
Thank you very much, Rayan. I'm going to actually, Louise, ask you the second question from the audience, which is that COVID has meant the idea of business purpose and stakeholder capitalism has become an imperative rather than an abstract idea. How can businesses fast adapt to put people before profits? So you unmute yourself.
Thanks.
Lovely, thank you.
Thanks, Linda. This is a fascinating question, and I think it ties in very well with the previous one. What we've been seeing since the beginning of this pandemic and the economic crisis is the huge diversity of situations across businesses. You have firms operating sectors, take hospitality, travel, that were so severely affected, and other firms and businesses that are operating in other areas that have not been affected so much. But we are also noticing this effort that has been made by firms to maintain their attachment to their workers, to increase their engagement with the communities, to basically make sure that they are present with people, their employees, their clients in this, and that they see that they are part of a broader community. This is very important. After all, losing workers, losing attachment to the people who work in firms goes far beyond the immediate economic costs associated with the headcount. It is a firm-specific human capital, knowledge that is lost. So I think there is more than ever this realization that maintaining this link, maintaining this attachment at all levels is a very important part of doing good business, but also making sure that firms work with governments and other stakeholders to build it, or to rebuild, if you want, confidence around the prospects and the recovery that economies need to, or the efforts and the policies that need to be undertaken. A lot that is involved, that is required in the recovery, has to do with building confidence. And businesses have a lot to do with that, alongside governments and the society at large.
Thank you. Same question to you, Chris. Has COVID meant that business purpose and stakeholder capitalism has become an imperative, not an abstract idea? So how can businesses adapt to put people before profits?
You know, I'm not sure I accept the premise that it was only in the abstracts. I think that I've seen over the last 10 years a major change, and I'm going to say in the last 3 or 4 years, an even bigger step up in stakeholder capitalism. And there are multiple reasons for that. partially, by the way, because people demanded it. So that's a good thing, you know, and therefore many governments also demanding it. So we see policies driving that, and also, by the way, investors and ethical investing being something that's really important. I think all of those things coming into confluence in the last few years means I'm not sure it is in the abstract, but there's no doubt that it's even less abstract now. I think that's absolutely right. I'm going to just a very tiny detour. I'm an optimist about the future. We do have to learn, and we have to become more resilient, as Ryan also said. But the way that we don't have to decide whether we put people or business first is to work out how they can coexist properly. And that's about collaboration across sectors, across government. Really importantly, though, it's really about working out how global remembers the importance of local. So you've got to combine the two, and that becomes a force multiplier where people regardless of their socioeconomic status or regardless of their geography, if you can leverage the power of globalization and of business and of commerce to help communities to create community-based solutions so that you touch people that are impacted in the micro geographies and in the micro communities, rather than just treating it all as one big problem, then you have a real unlocker there. So I think extensive relationships with communities is going to become even more valuable to businesses, and is of course incredibly valuable to societies as safety nets thin, as trouble exists. So I think if business takes the right approach, then that only amplifies the voice in the public sphere around how business and people, business and socioeconomic well-being can coexist. So I don't think they need to be mutually exclusive.
Thank you, Chris. We've got tons of questions. I'm only going to have time to pick up a few more. Louise, can I ask you, actually before, sorry, Rayan, can I come to you on this one first, which is, you know, how can economies essentially adjust to living with COVID in waves? What are the kinds of measures you'd like to see to ensure the economy is doing as well as it can?
I'll give my answer from a practical and a sort of a business-oriented view rather than a scientific or a medical standpoint. We're experiencing this actually as we speak in Saudi, where the economy has opened up and people are free to move with the proper social distancing and hygiene measures, and obviously masks in public places. And I believe with awareness, people can, even though it feels weird and it doesn't feel normal, but it is the best we have today to move on with business in a safe and healthy environment. And I believe it's doable. It was weird in the first couple of weeks. You slowly get used to it, and you slowly find a way to make it work. And to be honest, what we're seeing here is that actually happening. There's no need to kind of go all in or all out. I mean, there's always kind of a happy medium that we can work with as a business and as society that continues to respect the various measures, safety measures, without completely shutting down. And to be honest, what's happening globally, and I believe more so regionally, is putting a lot of the responsibility on the citizens and the individuals themselves to take over the responsibility of the collective responsibility of making sure that we can all operate, continue with life normally without risking a second or a third wave or risking ourselves in an unsafe way. So I think the first wave was difficult because there was a lot of panic. I think to the extent a second wave comes in, we have 4 months of data points and knowledge and education that we benefited from. And I believe people are adaptable, will move on and make it work. I think even if the numbers do increase, and they are increasing globally, it does feel like we can coexist and live with it much more normally now than we did 3 or 4 months ago.
Thank you very much, Rayan. So Louise, I wanted to ask you about, and this is a question that's come in, what is the one key action that you would like to see to drive a global economic recovery throughout the pandemic uncertainty?
Thanks, Linda. I think it's very hard to identify one key measure. It's really a package of measures. It's support at the macroeconomic level. It's support at the structural level. I think there is a lot that needs to be done and a lot that can be done to put the economy on a better footing for this period, the immediate period ahead of us of recovery, so of reopening activities, while making sure that we don't have a second wave. And then there are things that can be done and should be done over the longer period of time. I would say that it's essential to combine this, continue to support, maintain that support as needed, especially if we go into a period of greater uncertainty as to how the pandemic will evolve. Prepare the future. This word that I use, this reallocation, this recovery phase is extremely important. And to make sure that we respond to the changes in behavior that are taking place. We are seeing that people are reacting differently. What is the future of teleworking, for instance? How is this going to change preferences, and how those changes in preferences and behavior will affect demand in different parts of our economy, preferences for where people live, preferences for how they work. So those are things that will happen at an incredible speed, and we'll need to react to that as governments, as businesses, as individuals. So part of that, let's say, a journey towards a better world after this pandemic will require basically action in all those fronts.
Thank you very much, Louise. We are pretty much out of time. I think it's just now, there's still a lot of questions, so I'm sorry I can't get to all of them, but it's been a fantastically stimulating panel. And for those of you whose questions I couldn't get to, there will be a chance to ask questions in the second panel about businesses as well. So I will try to get to as many as I can. But as always, when you have a fascinating discussion, the number of questions just bubble through. And I think that's actually the best way I can think of to thank Louise de Mello, Chris Nicholas, and Rayan Fayez for a fantastically stimulating session. Thank you all. And a reminder to the attendees, you can follow the conversation on Twitter, go to the handle @B20, and also you can participate in the discussion by using hashtag B20Virtual. So I am now delighted that we have with us Dr. Hans Kluge. He is the World Health Organization's Regional Director for Europe. I'm so delighted, Hans, that you can join us today. There's so much for us to talk about. I'm just going to start off with the basic question, which is, how worried should we all be about a second wave of COVID-19, especially if it coincides with the seasonal influenza? If you unmute yourself, I'd be very grateful.
Yes, it's unmute. I think, do you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Linda. Thank you. It's a very frequently asked question. Well, about the word worried, I say that we should take it very seriously, but we worry a lot nowadays, and that's why mental health is definitely very high on our agenda. Let's take it positive. We know what works, but at the same time, it's true, we don't have pharmaceutical interventions, no effective treatment, no effective vaccine. So the behavior of the people and the actions by the government will ultimately determine what will happen in the fall. But definitely, COVID may well meet influenza, but also other diseases like pneumonia. So in that sense, we have to continue to take our own responsibility. What is some of the early lessons? We need a strong primary healthcare, we need community engagement, and vaccines work. So we have a vaccine for seasonal flu, so we need to scale up that coverage.
Thank you. I'm still worried, but I'm somewhat reassured. So I think that's the best we're going to be able to do on this one. Can I ask you about your view as to preparing for the possibility of a second wave? Are world leaders doing enough to prepare for the possibility? And really, what kind of measures should they be thinking about planning for implementing?
Right. Again, starting from the positive, I have been seeing, Linda, incredible examples of international solidarity. We just had a team coming out of Turkmenistan together with the German experts. I was last week in Turkey. Turkey has provided to 138 countries, can you imagine, supplies to really protect the healthcare workers. But of course, it's a bit of a varied picture. In general, I would say yes. What needs to be done is enlightened leadership, is accountability, and continued risk communication to engage the people. We have to remember, no one is safe until everyone is safe. So for those countries where international solidarity does not come from the heart, I tell them it should come from the brain, because no one is living on an island. No one is safe until everyone is safe.
So it sounds like the B20, the G20 really has a role to play to reinforce that message of collaboration.
Absolutely. The vision for Europe that I'm putting forward is called United Action for Better Health in Europe. So this partnership is very important. In fact, I just came out of the EU Ministerial Health meeting under the German EU presidency, and this notion of solidarity, particularly as we're going to go forward, hopefully, we don't know, but hopefully to the development of a vaccine, we should avoid that we get into the same painful situation where we had a lack of solidarity, where there was a shortage of masks, of personal protective equipment, and that is something that definitely needs to be, let's say, accentuated, yes.
Thank you. So as this is the B20 forum, do you say a word about the role that international businesses have in helping to prepare for and respond to a potential second wave? Should they be stocking up on PPE? What should they be thinking about in this kind of environment and strategically looking around the world? Your advice would be much appreciated, I'm sure.
Thank you, and I'm very humbled by this question opportunity. It's incredibly important, Linda. We're not going to get there without a partnership between the public sector and the private sector. And the whole COVID-19 has given this a tremendous boost. This is unprecedented, the speed of which a vaccine and treatment is being developed, and this is only thanks to such a strong partnership. The same for business communities, to take care of the employers, both on the principle that health is a human right, but also economically. I believe it was the International Labour Organization who estimated that in Q1 of 2020, about 5.4% of global working hours, which is an equivalent of about 140 million full-time jobs, was lost compared with Q4 of 2019, and is going to further increase. To give one example, we see that countries which are lifting lockdowns, they have flares, peaks, and it's normal as long as you contain them. This has been happening, for example, in coal mines, in food processing plants, and meat factories. We also have in cruises, in prisons. So in that sense, we have clear guidelines to business owners how to put public health measures in place and protect the people, not at least on the mental health, because these lockdowns have isolated people. And I was hearing that in elderly homes owned by private entities, people were passing away, not due to COVID, but due to loneliness. So only through solidarity and working together, we will beat this virus.
Thank you very much. And thank you for those very helpful examples as well. Hans, can I ask you, are you worried at all that in the event of a second wave, governments might be reluctant to enforce repeated lockdowns or restrictive measures because the economic concerns are bound to grow the longer the pandemic continues.
Right. I would even go a step further, Linda. My concern is there not for the second wave, but for the current first wave. If I look around in the 53 member states of the WHO European region. However, it is not life against livelihoods. WHO has now sophisticated policy advice enough to help countries managing active transmission of COVID-19 and have a running economy and educational system at the same time. And this is so important not to leave anyone behind. For example, children with special needs have been left out of digital learning methodologies. Economy, especially the small and medium enterprises and people who lost a job, has been hurt a lot. So in that sense, it's not pitching one against the other, but what's very clear, and that's my message when speaking to presidents, prime ministers on a daily basis, no health means no economy.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's they both go hand in hand, as you say. And I mean, I think, thinking about the way that a second wave has already hit some countries, and some of the restrictive measures or lockdowns have become more localized. And because the COVID hits different countries at different times, there is a less, it is country by country. What are your concerns as we begin to see local lockdowns in parts of countries and the sort of the variable impact across different countries? Do share some of your thoughts on that. It'd be very interesting to hear.
Right. The biggest threat, Linda, is complacency. No, any pandemic has been pushed back without a whole of society approach. So this risk communication to the people in a language that they do understand is important. I understand that people have a fatigue towards these restrictive measures. Then what we have to avoid is to pinpoint, is to blame people, because that only will increase populism and anti-vaccination movements. WHO European Office was the first one to publish guidelines on behavioral insight, and it works. It means targeted messages to targeted segments of the population, and also accepting, for example, digital health. Everyone speaks about digital health. Always there are going to be groups who either don't have access or are not willing to share their data with the government. And again, it's up to us to be more smart and strategic, to acknowledge this, not to blame, and to find approaches and policies which acknowledge this and avoid a digital divide on top of the social divide. Because if there's one lesson, Linda, that worries me from the COVID, it's again an exposure of inequalities. In Europe, the people who were richest, who could go to the ski resorts, brought the COVID sometimes back to the poorer segments of the population who could not afford healthcare. And that's where we have to stand strong, and we need the business also behind us to leave no one behind.
It's a very powerful message. Thank you. I'm now going to ask you quite an impossible question, so brace yourself, Hans. How long will we be dealing with additional waves of this pandemic? Is it until we have a vaccine? Is it until we have palliative care? And is there such a thing as herd immunity? Is that a solution? So
Definitely,
welcome your insights there.
The first part of the question is impossible, and I'm very happy that you tell it yourself. I mean, no one knows. But I say, let's implement what we know works. Every one of us, every individual is responsible that suspected cases can be found and traced. Every individual can wash your hands, can have cough hygiene, can stay at home when we are sick and have a physical distancing of 1 or 2 meters, and if you cannot avoid it, then at least wear a mask in public. So that's possible. Ultimately, whether COVID or something else, we are living in a planet of viruses. So this is just the new normal. Until we have pharmaceutical interventions, we have to abide by those new normal. And what is very important is to care about each other. I mean, one example again, gender-based violence. I mean, can you imagine that you are locked down with your aggressor as a woman or a child in the family? In peacetime, 1 out of 4 women, 1 out of 3 children has domestic violence. We will have to live with that one and be more creative. Now, on the herd immunity, from the studies among population, we call it seroprevalence, amazingly low. Between 6 and 16% only of the people have some kind of herd immunity, which means the majority of all of us are still exposed. The virus is still there. But we should not be in any panic. We know what works. And again, it's up to the government. If you see a peak, we have to be quick and localize it so that not necessarily the whole country has to be put under a lockdown.
Thank you. Hans, before I let you go, I'm going to ask you a follow-up impossible question, which is, might we have a vaccine and soon?
I would say I have never seen in history such a partnership and a coordination, instead of having islands working, right, together for development of a vaccine. My concern, Linda, is not when and whether we will have a vaccine. My concern, and I was speaking on that one to the EU Ministers of Health under the German EU presidency, is equal access. We know that blocks of countries have signed free deals, right? But what about the middle and the low income countries, right? That we don't see the same phenomenon like it was with the mask. But I think that we learned the lesson, and there's a lot of good news. There is, for example, to give an example of the business, right? Because sometimes the business is put in a bit of a, if you speak about health, in a shadow. No, we have to be proud of the good examples, like the COVAX facility, which is a tremendous facility pulling together. I mean, to give one example, AstraZeneca has committed to supply 300 million of doses of COVID-19 vaccines to the COVAX facility. I mean, this is amazing, right? So in that sense, we have to be positive and be open. It's normal that each country has to take care for its group of people itself, but then have a commitment for a solidarity. Again, thinking that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that's a big lesson of the COVID-19 so far.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hans Kluge. That is a terrific lesson for us all to take away. And I feel personally, I feel better. I'm not sure if this is what you're aiming for, but I personally just feel better after listening to you, that there are ways for us to live with this horrible virus. So thank you very much indeed for your time and for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you. And a reminder to attendees, you can follow the conversation on Twitter. Go to the handle @B20, and you can participate in the discussion online as well by using the hashtag B20Virtual. So the time has just flown, and we are now at our final panel of this B20 Virtual Forum. This panel is titled The New Business Reality, Responding to the Crisis While Preparing for the Future. We have a terrific lineup, and we're going to be focusing on addressing lessons learned and best practices put in place by the business community to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, Bob Moritz, Chairman of PricewaterhouseCoopers International Limited, Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization, and Diane Wong, CEO of DHgate. I'm going to ask all the speakers, and you've done it already beautifully, to turn on your cameras. And reminder to attendees, if you have a question for these superb speakers, please submit your questions with the name of the speaker is directed to, as well as your name and your organization in the Q&A box, which you can find in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So submit your questions, and we will get to as many as we can towards the end of this session. So to kick off this session, Bob, I'm going to turn to you first. And as with the last panel, I'm going to ask the other panelists to just mute yourselves until I come to you to increase the audio of this forum. So Bob, keep yourself unmuted. As a business leader with offices in various states of recovery, how do you adjust your growth plans and strategy in such an uncertain environment?
Linda, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly.
Great, thank you, and welcome everybody. Thank you for allowing us to join you today. It's clear with as you look at the effects of the first wave and the potential for the second wave that organizations, and PwC included in that, need to scenario plan and contingency plan for the environment which we're in. I would tell you for PwC, we're probably about 275,000 people around the world operating in 157 countries. And Linda, as you said, one of the lessons learned is to make sure that we are not applying a one-size-fits-all. This has to be an approach to look at growth and growth potential from the bottoms up. And each country, each location, each natural market or region has its own unique set of facts and circumstances. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we focus on the consumption side of the equation. And as a result, then redeploy our resources against where we predict that consumption will be. And clearly, as a service organization, we had to do that with our people and our technology. So there was a number of lessons learned within that. First, you had to take care of your people, people from a physical and a mental well-being perspective. As the first crisis, as the first stage came on, mental well-being became even more important than the physical from some perspective for those that were not affected by it. And that became important because we needed them to be engaged. The second piece now is, which is a real positive, is how do you find the capacity in your organizations and redeploy that capacity? One of the benefits, and again, they're not many, but one of the benefits from a business perspective is you found capacity. And second, you actually had a tremendous amount of innovation. If you allow for your employees to reinvent themselves and the work that they are doing. And you can see within us, we had a tremendous amount of innovation and entrepreneurship that created products to go with our services. And we're able to redeploy those people that had capacity now to the development and scaling up of those products. So each organization has to first repair whatever damage has been done. They need to rethink its purpose, its portfolio and capabilities. It's got to reconfigure them in a way that takes advantage of the opportunities that are in front of them, restart themselves as we talk about this great reset, but also report on it. And that last part becomes important because the more you report on it with transparency, the more trust in the system, more trust, the more motivation and the belief by your employees and your customers about the potential in terms of coming out of this and sharing the best practices of what you're doing and the benefit it has.
Thank you very much, Bob. All terrific insights there. Diane, as a CEO, what do businesses, from your perspective, need to plan for, thinking specifically about technology?
Okay, thank you, Linda, for having me here. We all agree that digital technology plays an important role in tackling the crisis. But I would like to point out one major gap in the globe: the digital divide between digital and non-digital companies. This gap in digital has become more pronounced and wider than ever amid the crisis. Actually, we have seen many cases, those companies equipped with digital technology have more resilience and could survive. But the people without technology, such as the internet connection, are kept away from online education, e-commerce, or medical technologies. At this moment, almost half of the world population, they have no access to the internet. It is all about the place you come from, the company status, and even the education you have. But this is wrong. These problems with the virus are the common enemies that we need to unite to tackle together. I think the key to address these problems is digital transformation. It's all about resilience, no matter for enterprises or individuals. The e-commerce industry, in China has actively promoted the international trade digitally in recent years, helping traditional offline companies going online. We have seen positive results in building resilient businesses, even though in this crisis. According to China General Administration of Customs, the cross-border e-commerce export trade surged 28.7% in the first half of this year, compared with a 3-point slump in the total goods export. So for example, we found the businesses in our platform and our partners, they deploy digital tools to sustain their business across the key functions. They have leveraged social marketing, such as live streaming, to generate traffic, AI and big data to adjust their product portfolio based on the consumer needs. And we also found logistic companies, they have applied AI and big data to digitally manage the traffic capacity. And we also work with banks to lend microloans through the online channels to MSME, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, in a second, based on fintech. So our sellers' business outperformed the market. Their sales increased by 30 to 40% in April and May, year over year. So we can see the power of technology. They have been more resilient to the crisis. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane. Absolutely fascinating statistics there. Guy, if I could turn to you and ask you about the role, what role businesses have in protecting society against the impact of a second wave?
Well, of course, I have to preface my answer by saying I hope to God there won't be a second wave. So I don't think we ought to embed the assumption into the discussion. But whatever happens in the future with the pandemic, and thank you for asking Dr. Kluger all those questions I wanted to ask but was too scared to ask. The point, though, is really about the world of work. Now, what we've seen this pandemic do is to plunge the world of work into the biggest crisis in living memory by a very large scale of magnitude. And frankly, the primary actors in handling this situation has been the state. I mean, $10 trillion spent, and by and large, businesses have been on the receiving end of support from the public purse, and that sort of resonates with 2008, 2009, and it's the context in which your question needs to be placed. Now, what is the corresponding responsibility of business as we try and get out of this horrific situation that we're going to find ourselves in? We're going to find ourselves in a situation whenever, by the end of this year, let's say that, where unemployment has gone through the roof, poverty has gone up, inequality has gone up, public and private debt has gone up, and probably political anger and frustration has gone up. It's a very unpromising circumstance. So I think the business response has to be placed in that sense. One might think, and I think, that there is a reciprocal responsibility incumbent upon business to, in a sense, react to the public support it's had in public policy, quite rightly had, because we needed to save businesses, viable businesses that might otherwise have gone under. It's just one way of preserving employment, maintaining incomes. But the question is now, in the circumstances that we emerge from this, at least a first wave, how are businesses going to behave? And one of the things we hear a lot about, isn't it, is about a new normal and how business is going to behave in a new normal. Not a phrase I particularly appreciate, but there seems to be an assumption. It's an assumption that the world of work is going to be qualitatively different in the future after the pandemic than it was before. Now, the question which I find is not often put in that regard is, would it be different because we're going to make different choices which are open to us? Or is it going to be different because of the circumstances we're obliged to act in, cohabiting with a deadly virus? And they're two quite different questions. So let me just pick up on one thing that's already come out in the conversation, Linda. It's as if the pandemic has pressed the fast forward on the digital revolution, and in the world of work is going to, by preference or by obligation, be a digital future of work. Now, that sounds very attractive, and there are certainly many opportunities and good things that might come from that. But look at it from, a broader societal perspective. Are we going to have the dematerialization of the physical workplace? No more collective workplaces? What does that mean for the employment relationship? What does that mean about the regulation of working conditions carried out from home? What does it mean for all of those work-life balance issues? These are things which business, if it's going to take that road, I think owe it to society to be interested in. I agree what was said earlier on. Companies need to look after their people, and that applies to their physical well-being, the protection that's been offered. Also, I think very much the psychological well-being. I mean, remote working, if my own workforce is anything to go by, it's not an easy thing to get through. So in several respects, I think business has to look beyond, and I hope it will, and has an interest in doing so, just beyond that opportunistic, if I can use that word without too much prejudice, thinking, well, if this is the way the world of work is going, how can our business model adjust to make sure we come out the end and come out intact and doing well? Fair enough. But what are the wider societal impacts? Same thing if you're going to redesign global supply chains. If they're going to be shortened, simplified, redirected, that's going to have an enormous impact on people around the world. So there is a much broader debate, I think, to be had than might be had about how business can help dig all of us out of this very bad place that we're in right now.
Thank you very much, Guy. In fact, if I want to come back to this future of work and the COVID impact towards the end before we open up to questions. So we will revisit some of these with all of you. But before we do that, Guy, if I could just ask you a follow-up. Could you assess the measures that have been put in place to protect employees and maybe talk through what more could be done?
The calculations we've done, and we've based these on the reduction in hours actually worked in the world, because that takes out the complications of if you're employed but not working, if you're unemployed or not. We've seen a drop of about 14% in hours worked in the world in the first half of this year. That's the equivalent of wiping 400 million full-time jobs out of the global economy. That's how much we've fallen off the cliff. Now, what happens next? As we unlock, as companies can get back into operation, as economies can unlock, we're all asking ourselves, and it's beyond my pay level, the shape of the recovery, the V's, the L's, the U's, the dollar signs, I don't know what else there is to be there. And we just really do not know that. But what I think we do need to, and we always have, I think, to be as global in our perspectives as we can, what we should not ignore is that, there are 2 billion people in the world, 60% of the global workforce, who work in total informality and whose choice is to go to work or to eat. I mean, if you don't go to work, you don't eat. And so people have been locked down and cannot earn a day's wages. Well, they don't eat that day. And that's what's happened to 1.6 billion people and their families. So issues of social protection, issues of informality, which we've always known about. It's taken the pandemic to make us really understand what the consequences of our own failures have been. So we're in a very, very tough place, I think, right now. And I worry that political anger is going to be increased by the effects of the pandemic, and the only way out of that is to communicate, to reassure people, and to have the type of dialogue that can get us forward. The $10 trillion that's been spent on stimulus has been spent by rich countries. 88% has been spent by rich countries on themselves. The developing world, well, a lot less. We haven't seen the international reflex. No, we're not all out of this until everybody, and nobody's out of this until everybody's out of it, as Dr. Kluger reminded us. We haven't really acted on that reality yet. And the international community and the G20 is one great place for that. I think has to, in some ways, rediscover the reflexes that got us out of the 2008-2009 situation, avoiding the worst.
Thank you very much, Guy. A lot of food for thought there. Bob, can I turn to you and just ask, can you describe the trade-offs or some of the calculations your clients are facing? Because many of them do confront potential layoffs and, of course, mounting cost pressures with uncertain demand. So just kind of talk us through what you're hearing and what you're seeing.
Absolutely. And I'll try to pick up what Diane and Guy talked about as well. First, these organizations are, in fact, applying the lessons learned from the last crisis, not just the first wave. As Guy rightly said, we still are digesting the lessons learned from the last crisis. One of the lessons learned was the increased stakeholder expectation and the amount of, as a result, distrust in the system. And what role does business play in that system? So they're very conscious of the choices they're making and trying to be more transparent about the commitments, the actions, and the outputs that come from that. So there's three big trade-offs that all of them have been dealing with, and it's a conflict that the management team struggle. At the start, as I said, everybody was focused on people first, safety and physical and mental well-being of people, and the employment of them. The reality is, as consumption and demand slows down, the question is, how much labor do I need if I'm able to work and operate? Or can I even get people to work? Because, in fact, a certain city, country, or region may be shut down entirely, which is one of the big issues with the small to medium-sized enterprises. So the choice is, can I carry them? And at what expense is it to the bottom line and to the investor community? When can I bring them back? How can I bring them back? And how quickly can I bring them back? And this is the challenge now that all CEOs are trying to manage. The second piece is then the additional contributions that they are making to society. One of, again, the lessons learned is business does contribute to society. So how much can I give? To who can I give? Pharmaceutical companies, healthcare companies, and those logistical businesses. How do I make the choices of where to spend my time and energy to bring those resources to bear? If masks are needed, how will I think about who gets them first? Or if a vaccine is developed, who will get it first? Even though my operations and production may be in one country, the needs, as Guy rightly said, are throughout the world. The last piece is the conflict of what to commit to, what to say publicly, and what to react to. The world is being a judge right now in terms of how they're behaving. And that's why it's so important to think about what commitments you consciously want to make, when you choose to engage with those stakeholders, what to report and how and when, and describe not only what you're doing, but why you're doing it. And remember, one of the conflicts is the more you open yourself up, the more you're open to criticism. Never mind the positives that come through this. So striking the right balance becomes extremely important. The last point is this concept of short-term versus longer-term or medium to longer-term. I will tell you, us, for example, and I'll use us to be a base case. Each organization has to come through this and think through not necessarily what they want to do to get back to the old norm or move to the new norm, but rather define their new norm and don't ride whatever it may be. When we went virtual at the start of this crisis, we went very early. On any given day of our 275,000 people, 15,000 of them work remotely. The rest are in our offices or at client sites. At the height, 265,000 were working remotely. We had to spend all the money and time and energy around infrastructure. Going back to Diane's point, we had to make sure the infrastructure was right. We had to make sure our people were skilled. And we had to make sure we had resiliency in the system. Today, from my shoes, I don't want to be at 15,000. I definitely don't want to be at 265. But I'll find the right number in between over the long term and drive people to get there. And those are the kind of challenges CEOs are trying to get to, because it will be, as Diane said, the ones that are resilient and bringing humanity and technology together and agile, and those are the ones that are going to survive. Said briefly, and I've said this many times, what COVID has done is accelerate and accentuate the trends we were already seeing. We were already seeing before all this happened a differentiation between winners and losers because of their digital IQ. This now will put that on steroids. And those are the kind of decisions and debates that are happening in boardrooms and ultimately with the management teams. And part of that becomes M&A and other aspects in terms of what to sell to sustain, what to buy to sustain, and redefine brands as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Bob. I will be interested in hearing what that number ultimately is, by the way. That's a very big range to be coming to a point. I do want to talk more about sort of the future of work. I think it'd be quite interesting because we've heard that we could have waves of this pandemic to think through. So I think that perspective would be really good to have. But before we do that, Diane, I want to turn to you and just ask about, we've talked about the digital divide, we've talked about companies with that capacity without, and we've also heard about informal employment. Another segment of society is women, one of the groups that have been hardest hit during the pandemic. Can you share your thoughts on how businesses can do more perhaps for women and try and mitigate some of that?
Okay, Linda, I think that's a great question. Actually, after the first wave, I believe many micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, they have more and more understanding of the importance of the digital transformation. However, we found that they're facing many challenges along the way, especially on digital skills. For example, they always ask how to use live streaming, how to generate online traffic, and how to access to e-financing, and where to find the digital talents. These are common questions for all SMEs, particularly women-led businesses are more fragile and experiencing problems accessing skills, technology, and finance. And during the crisis, according to the UN, business owned by women are particularly impacted by the digital divide, and they are lagging behind. So as a female business owner, I'm especially keen to help this business. So in fact, digitalization can bring unprecedented opportunities for SMEs and women, providing everyone with equal competition. And the entry barrier has been dramatically lower given the mature technologies, tools, and services available in the market. So everyone can simply use them, even sitting in the living room. Actually, one story I would like to share is from a female entrepreneur, a single mother, a Canadian lady named Sarah. In order to support her family, she leverages digital tools to become a job shipper, sourcing baby toys and accessories from an online platform and reselling them on her online mommy community on Facebook and Instagram. So today, she becomes a very successful entrepreneur at home while enjoying the time with her kids. So in fact, we have seen hundreds and thousands of mom and young girl entrepreneurs like Sarah in the whole world apply digital solutions in running their own businesses. But this is not enough. I think we must get governments involved into promote this agenda. So we have called for collaborative support to SMEs and women in B20 Digital Task Force and the Women in Business Advisory Council to achieve inclusive economic growth. We also launched initiatives in the APAC Women Connect program to support women. Sarah once told me, I'm the change I wanted to be. So with the joint efforts from the public and the private sectors, I believe we will have more Sarahs in every country and in every city, fully leveraging technology to achieve their dreams.
Thank you very much, Diane. It's actually one of the sayings that I always find, most among entrepreneurs particularly, but not limited to them, is when they say things like, be the change you want to see. So thank you for that. Before we turn to the questions that I have coming in, there's quite a few. I just do want to touch on a bit more of working through the pandemic in this remote sense. So I'm going to come to you, Bob, and then come to Guy on the same question. So Bob, one of the things that came up in the PwC CFO survey is how little drop in productivity executives saw while people were working from home. So what does that mean for the future of working, of physical offices, of those decisions?
I think there's two elements that are really important to focus on. There was within organizations generally, and again, those particularly like Diane said are digitally equipped, but there was latent capacity in their organizations. They perhaps didn't capitalize on that capacity, but it truly exists. And what the world just went through is the biggest case for change and the biggest case study for the benefits of leveraging technology in a way that we see today. The question now becomes, what do I do with that? So there's a couple of things to think about. First is, as CEOs think through not only this first wave coming out of it, but even preparing for the second wave, let's remind ourselves, it's not for those that are employed today, return to work. It's return to the office. They've probably been working. We still have an issue to deal with getting more people to work. Those that are unemployed are not advantaged enough to have the opportunity. So the question is, how do we enhance trust to encourage people to come to the office? And that trust becomes so important by leveraging technologies like contact tracing apps and other aspects like that, both in the office for the business, but also in the ecosystem in which they operate, like the public transport. Second is redefining what is the contract with your employees. Do you have to be at the office? Do you have to be there all the time? Do you have optionality in that? And defining that environmentally and giving people the option so they can express what they are hopefully happy to do and perhaps concerned about doing. So making sure that you understand that and setting that environment is usually important. Third piece, how many do you want in the office? And what are the downstream effects associated with that? As I said to my, as I used our example, we will not need as many people or square footage or square metrics in an office space. What we likely will move is maybe a hub in a city and maybe more regional spokes around that city. And maybe what we have is an employee that used to come to work 5 days a week, now coming to the main office 1 day a week, maybe to the hubs 2 days a week, and then maybe working remotely for the other 2 days. So it's a hybrid solution as we look ahead. The second point I want to raise, though, is this issue of finding and matching capacity. So we all know that there is going to be a labor issue. Guy talked about that with the unemployed and perhaps those that cannot be employed for whatever reason. We have to make sure that organizations find and leverage that capacity and put it into something new. And we can focus on giving people the skill sets on one side and leveraging that capacity. But if there is no job or opportunity on the other side, it does create the opportunity for social unrest. So for example, in Australia right now, we are working with Google and Salesforce to actually come up with an application for organizations that have excess capacity to more quickly share that capacity with others in need. So this way, the amount of time between that capacity and the use of that capacity is important. And organizations need to do that for the longevity and sustainability of their employees, as well as themselves, but also equally as important for the implications on society overall.
Thank you very much, Bob. That's a brilliant segue, actually, to Guy. This impact on society, what would you like to see in terms of measures to try and adapt the policies to adapt to this change in the way that we might be working in the coming years?
Well, let me just begin by saying a lot of the things Bob has just said resonate very strongly with the experience we've been through actually as an organisation in the last months. Firstly, that sort of productivity spurt. I mean, there is a sort of I don't know if it's just the circumstances or the potential being discovered, but there was a real spurt in the first, I would say, 4, 5, 6 weeks of this process. I have the impression, I can't give the metrics for it though, that that is a perishable good. I mean, that I don't think can be sustained just by improvisation. I think if you're moving from a rather traditional way of working into something quite different, you won't sustain that momentum unless you start to think it through, put methods, put institutions, put regulation around it. But I do recognize that latent potential. It's a great way of saying it. We discovered it. But for the broader questions, what do we need to see done? If we are going in this direction, I think this notion of confidence and trust, and that people think that they're not on the wrong end of a process over which they of no control and no choice. It's just what they've been given, and it might well be to their disadvantage. That's one road we could go down, or perception of a road. And the other is, hey, this opens up some really interesting ways of organizing your working life and your private life. Let's do it together. Let's think it through. I think both of those roads are possible. I hope it will be the road, not traveled, that would be the best one, if you see what I mean. And I think, I don't know if this is just me or where I work, I don't know, but I've always felt, and it's always been my experience, that there is something social about the work experience, not just the product of what we do, but the act of working. And that's about human interaction, and it's about actually collective interaction. And there is a lot coming through now about the isolating, the really tough isolating experience of working remotely. Now, I'm not saying that these are, insuperable obstacles to going down a new road, but they do need to be taken into account. And the last one, and I hear it quite a lot, is that, if I don't come to the office anymore, if I don't have an office, if I don't have a physical workspace where I meet my colleagues and everything, very soon I won't be an employee of the company anymore. I'll be a contractor of the company. My employment relationship will also go, and we'll be moving to, a gig setup, the consequences of which are probably not fully apparent or welcome to me. So we've got to embark on this journey, I think, with all of those factors in mind and a collective willingness to address them. I'm going to say in an honest way. I hope that's the right way to put it.
Thank you very much, Guy. In fact, you and Bob have essentially answered the question that had come through, which is, can we expect companies to have the same degree of tolerance and flexibility in the case of a second wave? And it sounds as if there's a few issues to iron out, but certainly I think the sense is there. We only have a few minutes left, but I do want to pose the other question has come into Diane, which is the pandemic has demonstrated the need for upskilling and reskilling employees to adapt to this, if we don't want to use the word new norm, new normal, so this something is enough being done to help equip companies with the skills to be ready for what lies ahead. You're muted, Diane.
Yeah. Actually, we see a lot of problems in the first wave. Especially the virus has exposed many issues in the global supply chain. According to WTO's forecast, the world merchandise trade is to plummet by between 13 and 32% this year. Furthermore, we have seen the traditional supply chain delayed the global response effort, including a lack of PPE, low production capacity, non-transparent information between buyers and sellers, and unsmooth logistics. So as Bob mentioned, the urgent need to design a more resilient and a smarter supply chain, I think that has been one of the main lessons in this crisis. So technologies like AI, e-commerce, cloud, big data, etc., have been proved provide real-time information on production and market demands, expand the sales channel, create transparency on product details and tracing, and share consolidated regulations on products and customers. So during this crisis, we've helped MSMEs to proactively adjust their operations in the whole supply chain. Let me give you an example. We recently helped a merchant going online, which was a typical traditional offline company. It is a toy manufacturer in Eastern China, having a great sales in offline channels from Walmart and Target in the US over 11 years. The unexpected crisis hit this company severely because of the offline channel shutdown and his single market strategy. We've helped this company in two aspects. First, we help them connect with our one-stop, we call the digital trade center system in the overseas, and expanding from offline to online. So he can sell products to local online small and medium-sized retailers and wholesalers other than regular customers. And second, we expand his products to more market using more online e-commerce platforms. So this kind of SaaS system that we have connected his products to over 10 e-commerce marketplace in just 2 minutes and 38 seconds only. So yeah, thanks to the digital transformation, his business in this crisis is even better than last year, increased by 30%. So we can see that both supply chain brings over huge potentials for MISMIS in that.
Thank you very much, Diane. I'm so sorry we are out of time, but that's a great example as to a way to upskill people and businesses is really to get that expertise. You don't have to do it all yourself. I think it's a very important example for us to conclude on. We are out of time. We have had such a fantastic discussion. I can only thank you, Bob Moritz, Guy Ryder, and Diane Wong for this terrific discussion. And on the whole, it's been a wonderful forum. It's covered a huge amount of ground. My takeaways are to stress that not only must we prepare for a second wave, potentially, we must plan for an uneven recovery and for businesses to work with governments, because collaboration has never been more important in all of the areas that we've covered. So thank you again to all of our speakers today. We greatly appreciate your expertise and the time you've taken to spend with us. To all participants, we hope you enjoyed today's event. And please be sure to follow us on Twitter at B20 and also visit our website, b20saudiarabia.com for updates. Thank you all very much for joining us. And please, please keep well. Take care.